Well, this has been a very human-centric approach of spatial design you've been witnessing, and we'll continue along the same way of thinking with the next speaker. Next speaker, Stephanie Akkaoui Hughes, is trained as an architect and worked for quite a couple of years at OMA, the office run by Rem Koolhaas, known for the work of Rem Koolhaas, and in the meanwhile has another 8 or so partners. So Stephanie worked on a couple of projects in Qatar, and from there on she designed her own office in 2012. Akka Architects, based here in Amsterdam, but with a completely different approach than OMA. So OMA is a world-famous architecture firm, well known for its, let's say, iconic buildings, although they do not seem to strive to build iconic buildings, like the Rotterdam building in Rotterdam, like the Dutch embassy in Berlin. But Stephanie approached her work as an architect from a completely different perspective, from a human perspective. Why she did that, and what the approach is, and what it will deliver for people using spaces, she will tell you in a couple of seconds. So, how to design human interaction? That's the question that Stephanie will address. Please welcome Stephanie Akkaoui Hughes to the stage.
All our actions are interactions. There was an architect who was asked to design a university campus on a site that from above would look something like this. So she goes ahead and she designs the 3 different departments. However, contrary to the expectation of the staff and students of the university, she doesn't place down any routes or pathways. Instead, she plants the whole site with grass. After the first semester, paths appear in the grass. The architect then comes back and paves these pathways just as they appeared. And she noticed 3 things, 3 concepts that we worked with and that you can apply in your respective roles as well. Those are the intelligence of users, the honesty of behavior, and the quality of time, the value of time. Now, before I dive into these concepts, I'm going to take a moment to redefine 2 essential notions I'm going to be using today. So on my count of 3, I'd like you to shout to me the first word that comes to your mind when you see the next slides. Are you ready? For the people eating, swallow. Right, are you ready? Okay, I can't hear anything. Right, 1, 2, 3. People talking. Right. So interaction is literally inter and action. It's the action happening in between 2 or more entities. Now, a relationship is a status between 2 entities. An interaction, you have to think about it as that status put into action, energized, made alive. An interaction is a living relationship. Now, any interaction you can think of, any at all, always happens within a certain context. Context is the second notion I'm going to redefine here. Context gives meaning to our interactions. Without context, it's very difficult to understand the meaning of an interaction. I'll give you an example. Robert, maybe you can help me out. Can you stand up and put your right hand up? Great. Now, what is Robert doing? Any ideas? What if I said he was in New York City on a street corner? What if I said he was 12 years old in a classroom? Right, thank you. Context gives meaning to our interactions. Otherwise, there's a very big chance that there is a misunderstanding of the interaction itself, and then you see how that leads to quite considerable consequences. Right, so now to come back to the questions, how can we gather the intelligence of users? Is anybody familiar with Robert Greenleaf? No. Robert Greenleaf in the 1970s in the world of business spoke about the concept of servant leadership. And he said that good leaders must first become good servants. Now, Greenleaf is talking here about this notion of service not as a dictatorship, but as a service, a mature form of leadership. I'll illustrate. Imagine I'm standing here at point A, and I have in my hands a collection of bricks. And I need to get the bricks to point B there without moving. What do? Shout really loud. Throw them. Excellent. You throw them, they're there, you're done. Now, I'm still at point A, but instead of bricks, I have in my hands a collection of birds. And I need to get these birds to point B there without moving. What do? Birds, yeah. Quick, quick. If you let them go, they will fly, so that's not going to make them go there. Any other ideas? Food. Are there any engineers in the room? It's okay, don't be shy. Show hands. I asked this question once to a group of 300 engineers, no blinking, no hesitation. Everybody said, you kill the birds and you throw them. Of course, if you throw food, that's an example of leadership by pull and not push, and that's an example of a mature form of leadership, one where we would be moving, even as designers and architects, from being dictators way too often into being facilitators. Now, what is the notion of facilitation? I'm going to go back to the story of the architect and the campus, and I'm going to highlight 3 qualities of facilitation. They're quite provocative design guidelines, so bear with me. Facilitation is first and foremost creating things incomplete. Now, the architect didn't finish and seal the design. She didn't decide herself and dictate where the path should be. She left the campus unfinished, so to speak. And that was exactly the invitation for the staff and students to give their input. Designing incomplete facilitates interaction. Designing impermanent also facilitates interaction. She didn't cover the site with asphalt, but grass, which is intrinsically organic and records input over time. And the last quality of facilitation is designing things imperfect. The paths were not in expected usual locations, and they weren't straight as she would have drawn them. We're talking here about the human aesthetics as opposed to the sharp, cold, and so-called minimal modern aesthetics. We're talking here about celebrating the humanity of even inanimate things. You can imagine the face of our clients when we tell them we're going to design buildings that are incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect. The point here is that facilitating is creating these contexts in a way, where appropriate and when appropriate, that are indeed incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect. So to gather the intelligence of users, we're talking here about facilitating their interactions as a first main goal. Now, what about the honesty of behavior? Now, I'm an architect. I'm trained to deal with form, as you might imagine. I'm not interested in form at all. I'm interested in flow and how people move around the space, how they interact with it, what they use, what they don't use. You see, in this example, it's not what is built. It's the space around it that is actually the value for people. This is, of course, not to say the context doesn't matter, but the end point is not the context. The end point is the behavior that the context can empower. Remember it this way, it's not what something is, it's what it does. It's not about the sculptural approach to architecture, it's about what that creates in people. Again, this is not to say the context is not important, or the space or the environment we are in is not important, but it's only as important as the quality of the interaction it fosters. When you think from that perspective, the whole approach to architecture is different. The context is only as important as the quality of the interaction it fosters. And from that perspective, when we talk about harnessing the honesty of behavior, we're talking about observing flows, even beyond conversation. We're talking here about non-verbal input, about observing flows and behaviors. Now, the quality of time. Are you ready for another story? Are you ready for another story? Yeah. Right, so Oxford University in England is a very, very old college with very old buildings. Now, one building in particular was very, very beautiful. It was approximately the size of this space we are in here today, and it was very special because its roof was made of full-length trunks of oak trees. Full trunks of oak trees from one end to the other. It was beautiful. Now, that building was 150 years old. And after 150 years, the wood in those beams was beginning to rot and fall apart. So the faculty comes together and they have a meeting and they need to decide about a solution. Since they couldn't afford the cost of these beams with an academic budget, as you may imagine, one of the younger members on the faculty said, "Before you take any drastic measures, let me do some research." 2 weeks later, she comes back and she says, I am very, very glad we took the time to do the research, because we have actually discovered that the architect who built this very building 150 years ago planted a group of oak trees specifically for this purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, this is sustainable design. Designing sustainably, environmentally, ecologically are not new concepts. They're very, very old concepts. We're talking about designing sustainably in a way that it is about facilitating processes even 150 years into the future. And in a way that actually the sum of all the forces comes back to zero. And it's not 1 year or 5 or 10, it's 150 years and plus. Now, when we think of sustainability, most of the global discourse on sustainability is at this level. We talk about the physical quality of the materials and the systems. At best, we talk about where the materials come from and where they go after the project in a very advanced version. All of this is one of 3 qualities that sustainability needs to embody. So the first one is this physical quality that we're talking about. The second quality of sustainability has to do with this resilience quality. This is where we need to build systems that are able to assimilate and adapt and respond to the changes that will come at them. This is a responsive quality of sustainability, this resilience quality. Then, on top of the responsive quality, there is a proactive quality, and this is where we talk about an anticipatory quality. This is a proactive quality where we enable what we create to have everything in a system to be able to adapt itself by itself for the long-term future. What it's very interesting to notice here is that every quality is required to ensure the quality before it. If a system doesn't have good physical quality, it cannot be resilient and therefore cannot be anticipatory, and on and on. So to talk about the value of time, we're talking here about interactions along the 4th dimension. Not just until we deliver the project as architects, but actually for the 150 years plus to come after that. So those are the concepts that I shared with you so far. If you look at this slide, you will see that I'm already talking a lot about interactions. Now here's what we've learned. Do not design interactions. Do not even try. If you try to design interactions, you fall back into the trap of the dictator. Instead of designing interactions, we need to be able to design the context where interactions can emerge. So do not design interactions, design the context for interactions, and keep in mind that the context is only as important as the quality of the interactions it fosters. Feels a bit like a double bind. The point here is we're talking about what interactions. There is many different forms of interactions, and they range from, on a whole scale, from individual, personal, all the way to public and group and dynamics. What we need to know is that we've looked at a number of projects, and the main key interactions that thrive in any space and guide the space to thrive itself are 3. They're about learning, they're about collaboration, and they're about creativity, in the big sense of each of these words. And it's only when these dynamics and these interactions come together that we can talk about creating an added value, creating something of value. And an added value is what I call innovation. And that's not only to do with the technology and gadgets. Innovation as an added value has to do with everything from a social encounter that leaves a smile on your face all the way to solving climate change. All of this is innovation. So when we talk about it from that perspective, and you remember that we don't design interactions, instead we design the context for interactions, this is what happens next. The question is how? How can we design contexts that actually foster interactions? Now, this is the question behind our work at Akka. As Robert presented it, Akka is an architecture and urban planning firm based here in Amsterdam, and all of our work is driven by a specific vision. The vision is called architecting interaction, and this is where we look at architecture not as the end, obviously, but as a way to foster interactions. And this is where we look at that in the sense that why are interactions important? Interactions are important because we believe that they're actually the seeds of innovation. And remember, innovation spans from very little to very large. Interactions are the seeds of innovation, and this is why we focus then on driving innovation. Now, we drive innovation through the seeds, through fostering the interactions. And we don't do that by designing the interactions themselves. We do that by designing the context for interactions, the space. We drive innovation through the space. Now, many of you might be thinking, this is all good when you're designing a new building or moving into a refurbishment case, but what happens when you're not going anywhere at all? I'm glad you asked. One of our clients came to us about 3 months after they have moved into their brand new headquarters. They had paid a few million euros, hired a world-famous architect. They moved into this new building, and it failed miserably. Now, the building looked beautiful, but it did not work for the people in it at all. And this is where we came in. And we came in and we re-looked at the space and optimized it while people kept using it in order to be able to make it into a living space, to make it into the space that can foster the interactions that the people needed to be done in this space. And this is where you look at that, and instead of forcing people into form, we remodel the form around the people. And the result is always beautiful because the result is organic, and the result is natural, and the result comes from the people themselves. So even if you're not considering a new building or it's not even moving into an existing building, we're talking here about optimizing any space you're in. Now, what we've discovered with many clients is that space usually holds their innovation back. This is particularly true for companies that actually deal with innovation. Space holds their innovation back, and instead of that, we came along and we said, actually, we would like you to use your space as a strategic tool because it can drive your innovation further. It can help like a number of other resources you have on the table. And this is where we're talking about space that needs to fulfill actually 3 roles. The first role that space needs to fulfill is the role that we all know as designers and architects. It's what we call the mass. This is where you're talking about space as being a container, a backdrop to the activities, and it can be the most beautiful, the most inspiring, and the most functional space you've ever seen. It's still only in the first role. 2 additional roles that we require our spaces to do for the people that use them. The second one has to do with a communicator. This is where we're talking about space that has an ability to actually tell a story, to tell the story about the people using it, and more importantly and more difficult-wise, to the people that are using it day to day, and keep that story fresh. This is where when you walk into a space, you naturally feel and know what this community of people in the space are about. What is their essence? What are their values? What is their vision? What are they hoping to achieve, etc., etc., etc.? And you feel that from when you walk in. That's not about the logo on the wall in the companies. That's about the energy that you feel in a space when you walk in because of how it's designed, and more importantly, because of how people are using it. This brings us to the third role that we require our spaces to do, and that's the role of a catalyst. This is where we're talking about a very proactive role of space, where space needs to be actually enable the people using it to do what they need to do in the best way possible, and even encourage them to do things they didn't think of doing in the first place. This is the added value of space. And it's only when you have the culmination of these 3 levels that we're talking about a certain experience that emerges from the space. This emerging quality of a space, which goes from anywhere from a small added value of, let's say, a social exchange with a friend, all the way to solving global problems that we have to deal with. And space can foster and trigger all of these interactions that are needed. This is where we talk about holding spaces accountable. For us as architects, but also for clients. When they move into the space, how can they hold their space accountable? How can they treat space as one of their team members with specific deliverables, with a specific role, and what would that be? Think of space as a strategic tool. And if it is a strategic tool, then we need to use it. So we're talking here about this idea of creating spaces that foster interactions. And for that to become reality, you need a process. So to answer that question, we need to look at the process. Now, I'm an architect. I come from the mainstream background of architecture, and this is, in a very simplified way, the architecture process. It starts from the beginning of design, and it ends at the end of construction, if you're lucky. Otherwise, you're kind of dismissed somewhere earlier than that. The point of this is that when people move into the building, very often the architects have disappeared. They're never to be seen again, like a good criminal that doesn't go back on the scene of the crime. What happens here is this is when the living phase of the building begins. This is when people move in. This is where it all starts. And this is where I believe we should be involved to continue serving people and making sure the space serves them as well. This is where we talk about static architecture moving into living architecting. This extension makes the whole difference. But there is more. Anybody remembers this formula? Two people, very good. I'm not going to tell you much more about this. Basically, this is the formula of Einstein, E = mc squared, where E is the energy, m the mass, and c the speed of light. Now, I took the liberty of translating this into architecture, and this is what happens. The mass, the built mass, becomes the floors, the walls, the ceiling, the material, the stuff, the architecture, the bricks and mortar. Right? This is where we talk about the architecture and the physical space. Then we go into this idea of speed of light or velocity or interactions, and this is where we talk about the two additional roles of space that have to do with communication and have to do with catalyzing. And this energy that emerges is when we talk about the experience. If you look at this metaphor, it gives you a very different approach. There is a fundamental difference between focusing on mass, on delivering your space, what you were hired to do, or focusing on what that can space, what it can foster beyond itself, the value it can create long after it's actually done in its design. This is valid for any product or service you may be working on. There is a fundamental difference between focusing on M, on the mass, on the physical product or service you're giving, or focusing on what it can create for people beyond itself. I'll give you an example. We're working on, one of our projects is the offices of the municipality of Amsterdam, the civil servants of Amsterdam. If we were to focus on their space, we might end up with the best office in the world. That's still not enough. What we talk about is the future of governance. Yes, it's far, and then we bring it back to space. What is the future of governance? What is the vision of those people that are going to use this office, and how can we then design the space for them in a way that serves them best? So this is where you, of course, see that the experience is the E of E = mc squared, and it all comes together in that formula. Now, I showed you the simplified architecture process, and for us, when we ask this question and we look at how can we deliver much more than M, how can we deliver the experience, that process doesn't work for us. So what we need to do is we need to look at a totally different process. So we actually created a custom process for us to work with. Now, it's a 4-phased process, and the last phase only happens after people move in, after people start using the space or the building that was created. The first phase is what we call appreciate, and it's focused on creating an aligned understanding between the different people concerned by the project. And I don't use the word stakeholder because that very often excludes the user. This is an example that we had done for a school, for example, and you see that at the center are the students. And then it goes from there. And every group of people is able to give you different insights that you need to understand from them through different techniques of conversations and nonverbal observation, et cetera, et cetera. And it's from there that we reach this aligned understanding that we then in phase 2 can translate into a shared vision. Phase 2 is what we call the kernel, and this is the seed of everything. This is where it all comes together and where it all comes from in the next couple of phases. Now, after we have this shared vision, this is where we look at what is the space meant to do? Where are the interaction nodes? Where are the flows? How will people use the space? How can we serve them better? And it's after that that we then go into the main bulk of the architecture process, as you may know it. This is where we go into design development, suppliers, permit, applications, demolition, construction, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where, at the end of that phase, is traditionally where the building is done. Now, we stop at a point here where things are still incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect, and we move on to the last phase. Project by project, we decide when is good for people to start using the space. And it's in that last phase that we look at how are people using even one single room in a space, and what can we learn from that, and how can we bring then the final refinements that make the space have this extra level of experience. Even though people are engaged from the very beginning of the process, verbal communication is not enough. This is where we talk about the honesty of behavior in the real space. And this is that last phase that we have in this process. Now, what you realize is that the community consultation, which is the backbone of the process, is geared to get the insights, not the opinions, the insights from the different groups of people concerned by the project. And this is based on a very strong belief that we hold very dearly in our team, which has to do with the users themselves. And we believe that the users are the experts in how they use their space. That drives a lot of architects mad, so if somebody falls off their chair, bear with me. What happens here is, this is not to undermine the expertise of any other expert. This is just to add one to the mix. The users are the experts in how they use the space. And I'm usually asked two things here. The first one has to do with, Stephanie, you can't ask people what they want. People don't know what they want. And people will tell you the Ford story, and they will say, Ford, if he had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, and people laugh and they move on. Of course, sometimes people don't know what they want, but it is our responsibility to ask the right questions and to interpret the answers, to understand really what they mean. The second question I get is, well, if you just ask people what they want and you do as they say, then what are you doing? We never ask people about the space. It's not about what they want the space to look or be like. This is about their own dynamics. This is about their interactions. This is about what they want to achieve through their day. And then we create the space for that. What you see here is the users are the experts, and it doesn't matter if they're kids or adults. It doesn't matter if it's a very small project or an urban plan or a very technical project or a project about mobility, which we've seen before. This is really about people and what they can tell us that we might not know before them. What you realize very quickly with the process is that the last phase creates a renewed understanding, which means, of course, that the process is not a linear one, but a cyclical one. The process itself has three qualities. First of all, it's designed as an open process. If people refuse to collaborate, it doesn't work. It's designed as an incomplete process. It's also changing continuously and constantly during time, which means in itself the process is completely impermanent. And it is based on insights and on building upon each other's insights. So at any moment in time, the process keeps developing and itself is imperfect. Now remember, we don't design interactions, we design the context for interactions through that process. Before I conclude, I think we have some time for questions. Questions? Thoughts? Yes. Just shout.
You take a very scientific approach. For instance, the use of E equals MC squared.
Well, it's quite liberal.
Do you have any post-occupancy research that demonstrates the tangible benefit of what you're doing to improvement in productivity?
Sorry. I didn't know you were really concluding.
Okay.
So your lecturers.
Well, I have 1 minute of conclusion after the Q&A.
I know.
Yeah.
But
Otherwise,
you're done.
Yeah.
Oh, a warm applause, please. Give it up for Stephanie.
I was saved by the bell.
So then this gentleman with the question, which I'm very happy with, can have a proper microphone. So
Sorry about
please
that.
speak again.
Is the microphone on?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, great. You take a very scientific approach, clearly the use of E equals MC squared. I just wondered if you had any post-occupancy research that demonstrated the tangible financial benefit of your approach to organizations and how you might go about measuring that.
Yeah. Tangible, financial, I will point, they're two different things. Tangible, yes, financial, not yet. We're working with our current clients to then, on the last phase, and see how we do that. What we've done so far is a lot of observation of physical human observation, and slowly we're bringing in then the technology that we've seen. Might it be sensors or apps or things like that to be able to measure all of this. Our first goal is to be able to actually highlight in numbers what the benefit of such an approach is. Translate that into numbers. If you look at workspaces and offices specifically, for example, and companies, we're usually approached by facility management, CEO, depending on how small or large the company is. And at the end of the day, it becomes about three actually departments together. Human resources, real estate and finances, facility management, and even IT. So that's then 4. And so the benefits actually need to cover those four areas. Yeah. We're still in the development of that.
Any further questions? I have a couple. If you don't,
Go for
Stephanie, this is something totally different than your work at OMA.
Yes.
I suspect.
Yes.
How come? What would Rem think of your way of thinking?
I don't know. I don't know. OMA was supposed to be on stage this morning, but they didn't.
Will be tomorrow.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I'll ask him tomorrow, or David at least. No, I don't know, to be honest. I think, I worked at OMA for a long time, and for me, it was a tremendous experience. I learned a lot about what to do. I also learned a lot about what not to do, just because it didn't sit right with me. I think the learning I had there was fantastic, and then, I was thinking, well, I decided to be an architect for actually a slightly different reason. For me, architecture is not a product, it's a service. That makes a whole difference. Architecture also for me is not art. It's a service. It can be a work of art, don't get me wrong, but it's not art. I'm not an artist as an architect. For me, as an artist, you have your statement, you do it, you put it out there, people get it, people don't. As an architect, you're actually shaping the environment of people that they're going to use on a day-to-day basis. It can't be an ego-driven statement, and it can't be a sculptural approach, and it can't be coming from anywhere but the people. So our role, for me, is to really work from them and then give them the best we can to serve them. And I actually had a couple of conversations before I left OMA about developing that internally. Within OMA, yeah,
But no interest?
To do, no, not really, not really. I mean, it's understandable. It's a very different vision that is in OMA. So, so I started Akka.
What you suggest is that the work of an architect is not finished, not done and over with, if the construction has been completed and,
of course not.
And people enter the space. So is your proposal then to close, let's say, a 10-year contract with the user of the building to optimize the building continually?
I don't know if it's a 10-year contract. What we're experimenting with is, for example, different business models that actually happen after people move in. It could be a regular going back and checking. Once we have technology in place, that would be a much easier way of actually predicting any issues that might come. Some things are obvious. If the company is going through a merger or shrinking or growing, then things will have to be adjusted, but sometimes it's small changes, incremental changes, and we're looking at technology to be able to alert that, first of all, to the company themselves, and then, of course, to us. And it's just about going back and realigning the space to the people as opposed to forcing people in space. And for me, whether it's a 10-year contract or it's a long-term approach, it's also very noble a direction, I feel, because it means that we're not going to get away with it. That sentence, doesn't work, because we're still going to be there and we're responsible for this building working forever.
But you could also approach it from a critical perspective, saying that you kind of messed up and now you have 10 years to make things right.
Well, no, I don't believe that, because of course the process is very different from the beginning and things change. And what you see is at the beginning, when people move in, the next 3, 6, 9 or a year, things are actually smooth. And then you know that it works for now, but things changed. Now is a futile moment. I heard somebody was very upset with me a few days ago because, well, architects in general, because they heard that there was an architect who made a newspaper company sign a contract that nobody can touch anything after the architect has left. And a few years later, even a few months, people were really annoyed because they wanted these, this very ugly pedestal that you put under your desk where you put your papers and all of that. Architects hate those. And so the building was designed without them, but this is a newspaper company, and as much as we're going digital, people still need storage, and people weren't allowed to actually get them in the building. For me, you look at that and you look at the other approach, and if it's a service, that's not the right approach.
Talking about furniture, we have a lot of furniture suppliers surrounding us. Is there a specific kind of furniture that would foster the interaction that you speak about? Because that's also one of the themes of our labs, the We Lab, which is all about collaboration, co-working. So is there a specific kind of furniture, or would you see opportunities for another kind of furniture that will foster interaction?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there is always the furniture in itself, the good quality. You can talk about things on wheels. It's been a trend for a few years now. Modular systems. For me, that's all great. What's really interesting, and we're starting to see that as a need from our clients, is the business model of furniture. That needs to also kind of develop. In the way that when things move or change, relatively quickly, and you've invested so much in furniture that you can't exchange or give back, or so we're going into this direction of circular economy in that sense, also applied on furniture. So either we find ourselves actually phasing the furniture orders to say, okay, we furnish this space first, the client wants to see and test, and then look at how that's working, and then continue the order. There was a fear on investing too much in rigid, fixed things, that things might change after a relatively short amount of time. So I think that's really where there is an area for innovation on the business model and the supply model of furniture. And of course, the limitation is that it's still stuff. So how do you minimize waste as well from changing all the time, and budgets and things like that? So I would love to explore that more.
Okay, well, I connect you to one of the companies
Please.
exhibiting.
Yeah.
Any questions came up in the meanwhile? There's a question over there. There's a microphone coming your way.
Yes, I have a question to you.
can,
Great story. I'm really inspired.
Thank you.
And you seem to stretch the discipline of architecture really beyond what you're trained for. So I was wondering, do you collaborate also with like maybe an anthropologist or a psychologist? How is your team? How do you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I talk a lot about the users because they're the main missing group of people in the projects. We do the same with furniture suppliers. We get them in as soon as possible, engineers, contractors. And indeed, when we talk about community consultation and talking with people and actually asking the right questions and understanding the answers, we have some knowledge and expertise within our team. I had to actually take psychology master classes here and there when I wanted to start. And for larger groups, then we get in additional reinforcement. So psychologists, environmental psychologists, yeah, absolutely.
Any more questions? Yes, at the very back. Last row.
Thank you very much for your enlightening presentation. I have a small, let's say, quick question, because according to your presentation, I think the enlightening part for me is that you put so much important or focus on users, means for me people.
Absolutely.
Who is living in the space.
Yeah.
And all the stories you share or your projects you share sounds very successful, and it seems all the users were quite satisfied of what you are providing, in difference from others. I'd like to hear whether what was the biggest challenge to put so much focus on the users with your approach, and also was there any failures that you remember that you see? Okay, that's something what I learned from my approach, which I can improve in the future.
Yeah. One of the main difficulties is that, of course, people see us as architects, which we are, so they want to talk to us about the space. And they come in and they have these ideas about what the space should look like and what they like and what they don't like. And in that, there is a lot of opinions. And we have to redirect the conversation. It's not about the space. It's about who you are as a group of people, whether it's for a family in a private apartment or a company. It's about what you want to achieve. It's about your company vision, strategies, your values. It's about all of this, and people are eager to talk about space. So that's the first thing you always have to kind of readjust until much later in the process when we get to space. But we're not asking people to co-design with us. That's not the situation at all. The second challenge with opinions is that you have to actually have the maturity to understand the insight behind the opinion. It's not about what a person likes or doesn't like, especially when it's a public project. It's about what we can learn from the experience of that person. And that takes 1 or 2 or 3 steps further for us to understand. And this is where a psychologist and expertise from that angle is really valuable. Failure, we had a very interesting learning moment in one of the projects early on, actually, and we were having all these discussions with people, and it's impossible for 2 people to agree on the same thing. So, you kind of expect that going in, and then you deal with it, and you look for common ground, and you elevate the conversation and all of this. And at some point, something magical happened. Everybody agreed they wanted a tree in the middle of the office. And everybody agreed. And I should have kept my mouth shut and just said, okay, great, we'll have a tree. But of course I didn't. And I asked, what will the tree do for you? and things crumbled again, because of course the tree was representing different things for different people, and it wasn't about the tree. And the learning thing here is if we had actually put a tree in the middle of the space, and if we had done what people had all said they wanted, it would not have worked. So that for me was a great moment to learn that actually it's always the question behind the question, and it's about what people see and are trying to achieve behind what they know, which is a tree or a red door or a yellow chair or things like that. So that was really interesting.
Last question. If not, Stephanie, then again, the floor is yours to finish your presentation.
Thank you very much. I will conclude. You've probably realized by now that architecting interaction is larger than architecture. Somebody has already said that, which is great. We apply it to architecture and urban planning because those are our fields. What architecting interaction is really about is how can we innovate through interactions. And again, that means how can we create added value through interactions. And this is where we believe that every context needs to foster interactions, even outside space professionals. Every context needs to foster interactions. We're only talking about different interactions and interactions to varying degrees. Now, creating contexts that foster interactions, this is our focus, this is our essence. And remember, we do not design interactions, we design the context for interactions. And the question is, how do we do that? How do we create these contexts that foster interactions? Well, we do that by creating incomplete, imperfect, and impermanent contexts through a process that is in itself incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Very enlightening. So I can imagine you don't want to step down here with your heels, so please leave the stage sideways. Okay, this was the last presentation for this morning.